idea of a German navy was a little bit hindered prior to the 1870s by the lack of existence of Germany. Not to say, of course, that there was some great Central European sea that mysteriously filled in at that point and was then populated by industrious people in Lederhosen, but there was no nation-state by the name of Germany, or any nation of equivalent size with a different name in that area. The various Germanic states had possessed naval strength at various times in history, with places like Lübeck and Hamburg being quite significant powers back in the days of the Hanseatic League, but this strength had faded, and by the middle of the 19th century, the most powerful German state with any coastline, Prussia, technically had a navy, but Admiral Yamamoto could have counted the number of officers in said navy on his injured hand. 1848, however, saw the first major stirrings of the idea of unification. It had, of course, been discussed before, but a series of revolutions now demanded it. The resulting Frankfurt Parliament tried to establish such a state and voted money for Prince Adalbert to build a fleet, as the outbreak of the First Schleswig War with Denmark had shown that the much smaller northern nation was more than able to hold its own, in part thanks to actually having a navy, allowing the Danes to cut off seaborne trade to the German states, as well as to control the coastal movement of troops on land and at sea. Adalbert proposed a small but powerful fleet of 20 ships of the line and 30 frigates. 2/3 of the latter would be large, and the other third would be smaller patrol types. But this effort stalled out along with the unification efforts. Prussia did buy a few of the ships that were actually built, but most of the rest were auctioned off on the stocks to various interested buyers. Prussia would then try and manage her small fleet, but as steam and then subsequently iron took over, she found herself industrially incapable of maintaining or building a modern navy. Then the Second Schleswig War broke out in 1864, and once again, even the small Danish fleet with the pint-sized ironclad Rolf Krake proved to be a major thorn in Prussia's side. This led to the rapid emergency purchase of two small ironclads, the SMS Arminius and the SMS Prince Adalbert, the former having been built by a British company without a buyer on the theory that the new warship type would be so popular that someone would want to buy one off the shelf, and the latter was being built in France for the Confederate States, but the French Emperor then forbade the sale, and Prussia won a bidding war against Denmark for it. Although in this particular case they probably ended up wishing they hadn't, as the ship was poorly built and would have a very short and troubled service life. Both ships were, however, armed with locally made Krupp guns, starting a trend that would continue for quite some time. Now forcefully reminded of the need for a navy, Prussia would go on to purchase a number of other ironclads. The Kronprinz, Friedrich Karl, and König Wilhelm, two of them from the UK and one from France, and the last of these being one of the biggest and most powerful ironclads in the world when she was launched, although this being the early ironclad race, that title was very quickly taken by other vessels. But in any case, Prussia was also keen to develop its own industry, and the ironclad Hansa, as well as the three-strong Preussian class, were all built locally as German industry began to rapidly expand. Larger ships, however, were still only able to come from foreign yards, and the slightly larger two-strong Kaiser class were therefore ordered from British yards. With the Preußens and Kaisers laid down just before and during the Franco-Prussian War, these would be the last Prussian ironclads. The surprising ability of the small Prussian fleet to remain largely intact and even actually cause issues for the French Navy, which at that point was the second largest navy in the world, albeit obscenely poorly organised in that particular war, strengthened the idea of having a navy, a trend that was already growing with the founding in 1869 of Wilhelmshaven to complement the earlier acquisition of Kiel. But of course, the biggest success against the French had ultimately been on land. So while the end of the war saw the German state, and thus the Imperial German Navy, now formally established, it merely continued to exist for quite some time in the shadow of the much more important land army. As such, the role of the Navy was shifted towards a more Swedish model, as an integrated element of coastal defence, as opposed to a true blue water expeditionary force. This was reflected in the first post-war and thus truly German ironclads. The mid-1870s Sachsen class, which was slower, of shallower draft, compared to their predecessors, and since they weren't supposed to go anywhere far, they were also the first German armoured vessels of any appreciable size to abandon sail rigs. With that said, the German senior officers were still laying the groundwork for a service with more ambitions than just keeping the French away from the coastline. In March 1872, a naval academy was founded at Kiel, and a couple of months later the engineers were made into a formally recognised branch, the Machine Engineering Corps, and the next year the medical officers' ranks were made equivalent to similar ranks in the main army and the main part of the navy. And then in 1879, the Torpedo Engineer Corps was inaugurated, with responsibility for what we would today divide into torpedoes and mines, but at the time everything was just called torpedo. Attempts were made to try and enlarge the fleet further, and money was actually occasionally allocated, perhaps in part because a good chunk of it was coming from the French as part of the peace terms from the Franco-Prussian War. But although German yards were starting to catch up with foreign ones in terms of the size of ships they could build, they simply didn't have the number of slipways that other nations did, and so of the several dozen proposed ships, only a small portion would be built, with German ironclad construction culminating in the early 1880s with the SMS Oldenburg, another coast defence ship modified from the Sachsen design. The departure of the Imperial German Navy's first admiral, Stosch, apparently as a result of a clash with the formidable Otto von Bismarck in 1883, meant a new man at the tiller, but the new guy, Admiral Leo Graf von Caprivi, was, like Stosch, from an army background, largely as a result of the crash expansion of the Prussian and then German Navy in the early 1870s, resulting in a rather large gap between the capabilities of its previous senior-most officers and the administrative experience needed to manage thousands of men and extensive industrial and port facilities. Von Caprivi spent most of his time obsessing over a land war against France and Russia at the same time. Removed from Army Command to head up the Navy, he decided the best way to support this idea of fighting two continental armies with a navy was to develop a rather Byzantine coastal defence plan, and initially to propose a series of monitors, although the advent of the torpedo and the torpedo boat quickly saw him drop the latter idea in favour of the construction of numerous small attack craft armed with a new weapon. That they were cheap and required relatively few men also appealed to him, as he was quite open about the fact he wanted to minimise his own expenditure so that his true love, the army, could have more men, more funding, and more equipment. It was only when he had a year left in office in 1887 that he actually asked for funds to build new armoured ships, when it was starting to become painfully obvious that the early 1860s and 1870s era armoured vessels were now so far behind the curve as to be near useless. He did, however, push for and support the Kiel Canal, which was started in 1887, and he would manage to get the Navy's personnel numbers up into the low end of 5 figures, leaving the service with a fleet consisting of 18 armoured vessels of varying utility, as well as 18 cruising-type vessels in a number of different sizes. This was also the period of the Jeune École, and a certain amount of reasoning was put behind the idea that if France, which had a much larger naval infrastructure, was resorting to torpedo craft and cruisers to try and counterbalance the juggernaut that was the Royal Navy, then the even smaller German Navy must surely also take this approach, even if it was aiming for conflict with smaller navies than the Royal Navy, such as the Russians, or, ironically enough, the French. But this all changed in 1 year, 1888. In that year, von Caprivi left the Navy. Kaiser Wilhelm I died, was succeeded, for the spring at least, by his son, Frederick III, and then he also died of cancer, and was in turn succeeded by his son and Wilhelm I's grandson, Wilhelm II. This last succession was actually the reason von Caprivi left. For most of the 1880s, German warships overseas had mostly served to show the flag and occasionally establish or support the odd German colony. Wilhelm II, on the other hand, had grown up in close contact with and as an admirer of the massive British battle fleet. As with most European monarchs of this period, he was in some way related to Queen Victoria, and so he was welcome to Britain at almost any time. And now he was a young Kaiser, having succeeded well ahead of when he expected to, and he saw a chance to have a fleet all of his own that he could show off with. Von Caprivi tried to persuade the new monarch that the fleet was best kept small and the funds sent to the army. Wilhelm disagreed, and since he was the boss, von Caprivi had to go, to be replaced by Admiral von Mons, the German Navy's first, and as it turned out only, Chief of the Admiralty who'd actually come up through the naval ranks. Unfortunately, dying prematurely seemed to be all the fashion in late 1880s Germany, and so after having gotten the ball rolling on the design of Germany's first pre-dreadnoughts, the Brandenburg class, he promptly died in January 1889. The role of Chief of the Admiralty was then abolished and split between multiple posts, with the new, technically highest position being the newly created State Secretary of the Imperial Navy. This post was given to Admiral Heusner, who lasted a year before retiring due to illness and then dying the year after that in 1891. Although during his tenure Otto von Bismarck was replaced as Chancellor by none other than von Caprivi. Heusner was in turn replaced by Admiral von Hollmann, who bucked the trend by not almost immediately dying. Although von Hollmann was, like Heusner and von Mons, a career naval officer and thus in favour of a larger role for the Imperial German Navy, he was to a degree overshadowed by the Kaiser. Wilhelm II had gotten it into his head that his grandfather had taken Prussian, and then Germany, from a secondary realm to a great power of Europe thanks to his work with the army. And now he would take Germany on to true global power status by likewise elevating the navy. He seemed intent on eventually surpassing the British as the preeminent power in the world, but for now he recognised that he had a bit of a long way to go to catch up, and so instead he initially formed plans to strengthen Germany at the expense of what he saw as other smaller empires in decline that, with the right fleet, he could either strong-arm or defeat, in either case securing colonies and other concessions from them, which would of course build up Germany's colonial possessions. Spain, Portugal, Denmark, and the Netherlands all would feature prominently during these early 1890s discussions. Much like the French in the past few decades at that point, the German Navy thus began looking for any possible advantage they could utilise to qualitatively surpass their potential rivals. The Brandenburgs started the trend, mounting no less than 6 main battery guns in 3 twin turrets, one fore and one aft, as in more normal battleships of the period, but then with a 3rd turret amidships, aft of the funnels but before the mainmast. These were very transitional ships, with the first 2 having compound armour and the latter 2 a variant on Harvey steel as produced by Krupp. During their construction, newer 40 caliber length 11-inch guns became available, and it was decided to fit these in the fore and aft turrets instead of the older 35 caliber gun. The 35 caliber guns, however, would be retained in the amidships turret, as there just wasn't enough clearance there between the superstructure elements for the longer barrels. In the early 1890s, this didn't actually seem to be too much of a problem, as the battle ranges of the day were so short that the different ballistics between the 2 different types of gun were essentially irrelevant. But it would come back to bite the ships in the 1900s when rangefinders and later the advent of central fire control systems significantly extended battle ranges, and the differences in ballistic arcs became much more pronounced. However, although the je ne colle was definitely in the past at this point, in the 1890s the German Navy's main targets were, as we've just mentioned, the smaller and less modern navies, and thus the 2 other battleship classes of that decade, the Kaiser Friedrich III and Wittelsbach classes, took another approach which was designed to maximise technological advantage whilst also offering them a place at a larger confrontation later on. Leaning heavily into the hail of fire ideas of the period, but also somewhat restricted by German infrastructure limitations, Both classes embraced extensive secondary batteries, and although returning to a pair of twin turrets and using Krupp steel armour, they downgraded their main gun calibre from 11 to 9.4 inches. There was a certain method to this, though. Apart from saving space and weight for the addition of even more secondary guns, the theory ran that these new guns could take advantage of the increase in velocity made possible by improvements in metallurgy and propellant technologies to give the 9.4-inch gun enough penetration that, at least at close range, they would still be a threat to enemy capital ships, while also granting them a substantially faster rate of fire. The theory then ran that although a 12-inch gun or similar would of course hit considerably harder, the chances of those guns actually getting that hit accurately, if the carrier of those guns had already been hit multiple times by 9.4-inch shells, would be substantially reduced. You could also, of course, carry significantly more ammunition for a given amount of volume, and this, to some, gave the ships a secondary potential role as a large, long-range cruiser-type vessel to supplement the actual cruisers in dealing with enemy commerce. The lack of penetration against battleships anything over a few thousand yards was considered irrelevant, as with the fire control systems of the time, or rather the lack of them, the idea of hitting past that kind of range was considered frankly ridiculous. This approach becomes somewhat more obvious when you consider Germany's first armoured cruiser, which was laid down around the same time as the Kaiser Friedrich III's. It carried exactly the same main armament on a very similar displacement hull, sacrificing some armour for speed. Although almost 8 inches thick, the belt was actually quite substantial, and thus the speed increase was not quite as much as on some other armoured cruisers in other navies of the period, with first Bismarck reaching just under 19 knots. The dimensions of the ship were also almost identical to the Kaiser Friedrich III's, and at first glance, the only easy way of telling one from another at a distance was the slightly heavier superstructure and the greater number of secondary guns that could be found on the battleships. Major changes were coming to the Imperial German Navy, though, and that this first armoured cruiser, first Bismarck, was the very first of its type to be built for the Navy, and was laid down as late as 1896, gives some indication of how late in the 19th century the real changeover from coastal defence force to blue water fleet really began to pick up speed. But we'll briefly take some time to look at the non-capital ship production for the fleet up to this point as well. Starting down at the smallest level, the German Navy generally lacked the kind of small colonial enforcement craft typically found in other large European navies of the time. This loose collection of shipping was dubbed avisos, gunboats, sloops, and other similar terms depending on where you were, and was fairly ubiquitous in the established empires as both communications vessels, in an era when even telegraph stations had a relatively limited reach when it came to communications with ships that might be in distant oceans, and, of course, they were useful for showing the flag in various areas without committing too many resources to any given situation. Having started life with a half-dozen ships mostly requisitioned from unarmed rolls or quickly bought during the course of the Second Schleswig War and the Franco-Prussian War, the first decade of the Imperial German Navy's existence only saw one addition in this class, the Zieten, which was primarily intended to test the utility of the newfangled torpedo, which, as you'll recall, was quite popular with senior German naval officers at this time. The type in general was not all that popular in the Navy, though. There were some built in the 1880s in 1s and 2s, displacing between 1 and 2,000 tons, with the last such being SMS Hella, the sole vessel of the type built in the mid-1890s. Somewhat more popular, in the 1870s at least, was the screw corvette. Again, inheriting a small mixed bag of ships from the Prussian Navy, the Imperial German Navy would build a number of these ships in a steady procession throughout its first decade. These displaced roughly 2,000 to 4,000 tons, depending on the class, and they were somewhat more substantial vessels, considerably longer ranged, partially because they all carried full sail rigs. These occupied the role most large navies would use the smaller gunboat or reviso types for, since Germany's more limited overseas interests meant that sheer numbers of ships just weren't as important, and the larger ships' staying power meant that you actually needed relatively few ships to keep up a constant presence in Germany's relatively small overseas empire. They, however, would die out as the protected cruiser and its relatives began to appear across the various oceans in the early 1880s. Back at home, torpedo boats were acquired in small numbers until the early to mid 1880s, when larger numbers of ships started to be built in substantial classes. Since they were entirely intended for close-range defensive work, they were very small, with none breaking 200 tons displacement, and some of them even falling below 100 tons to double digits. Also found at home was a short spell of true coastal defence ship construction, as opposed to the earlier ironclads, which could at least theoretically go overseas. The late 1880s and early 1890s saw the Siegfried and then the Odin class constructed at the behest of von Caprivi, hence why Germany on paper seems to skip the late 1880s rush of really odd and bizarre ironclad designs I found elsewhere, as the trend for extremely large short-barreled guns and 20-plus inches of belt armour tended to be reserved for ships with a large enough displacement to actually handle those features, which the diminutive coast defence ironclads certainly weren't. Lastly, of course, there was the transition from the corvette and sloop type, as well as other such designations, to the rather grab-bag term of cruiser. With the coming of actual career Navy men to high command, came a rush of orders for these craft, the late 1880s and early 1890s seeing no less than 9 smaller unprotected cruisers and 8 large protected cruisers ordered. In each line of development there was a steady and substantial increase in size, from about 1,350 tons to just under 4,300 tons in the unprotected line, and from about 5,000 tons to just over 6,700 tons in the protected line. Some of the first such ships were ordered by von Caprivi as successors to the screw corvettes, but most of them were ordered by his successors, and so the rapid jump in size happened very early on in their development line as a result. In the latter part of the 1890s, there was a bit of a break in design choices. The Victoria Louise class of protected cruiser were quite substantial vessels, armed with a pair of 8.3-inch guns. The last 2 ships of the class displaced just over 6,700 tons. Here, German cruiser design would now split. Their heavy armament and large size would be carried onwards and upwards into the armoured cruisers, of which we've already mentioned first Bismarck. Most subsequent German armoured cruisers would be a little smaller and less heavily armed than their originator, but they would still be large vessels. On the other hand, the displacement of the largest of the avisos was combined with the 105mm armament of the unprotected cruisers and the protection scheme of the protected cruisers to start a new line of small German cruisers with the Gazelle class, which, due to only having turtle-back decks for armour, were also by definition protected cruisers. This would then start a pattern for the smaller type of German cruiser, which were trying to combine the small overseas utility vessel with the fleet support and scouting role, and this would see them come out a little bit smaller and less heavily armed than most of their immediate contemporaries. And so we come to the end of the 19th century. In 1899, the Kaiser replaced the High Command of the Navy with an Admiralty Staff, which in wartime was tasked with managing everything to do with the fleet except actually taking it out into battle, which would be the role of the admiral in charge of said fleet, although that individual's designation would change several times as the fleet expanded. Theoretically, the establishment of an Admiralty Staff put the Navy on a par with the Army, who of course had their own Army General Staff. But in practice it was actually the first major symptom of a rapid disintegration of traditional naval hierarchy, as Wilhelm appointed himself Supreme Commander of the Navy, and then tried to have all the various heads of their important stations report directly to him. This of course included Alfred von Tirpitz, who'd become State Naval Secretary in 1897, replacing von Holman. The commander of the main fleet, the commander of what was to become the East Asia Squadron, the various department and regional heads closer to home, and a few others also reported directly to the Kaiser. This seems to mainly have been the influence of von Tirpitz at hand. He encouraged the Kaiser to head everything personally, but of course, with Tirpitz being an incredibly strong naval influence on the Kaiser, it allowed Tirpitz to bypass the Admiralty staff and guide the development of the German Navy according to his own design far easier than if he'd had to compete with them to get proposals passed up a chain of command. The fact that the Kaiser, albeit somewhat contrary to his wishes, did in fact have other duties aside from playing Grand Admiral, also meant that when he was off doing other things, Tirpitz had almost a blank check, taking over many of the Kaiser's ostensible duties much of the time. This set of changes would signal the start of the true build-up of the German Navy, and soon the beginnings of the Anglo-German naval arms race, a period of history which I have already covered in another video. But to give you a bit of a lead into that, the changes that Tirpitz and the Kaiser enacted to eventually turn the German fleet from an interesting oddity to the second most powerful navy on the planet in the course of a decade and change would be easily seen in the next wave of German naval construction that would commence with the turn of the century. This included the introduction of newer, larger torpedo boats, what most would call destroyers, but which the Germans would insist on calling high-seas torpedo boats for quite some time to come. The 1898 type, which inaugurated this, would displace more than double what any previous German torpedo boat had, and of course the trend would only be upwards from there. Cruiser construction rose more in numbers than size. They retained the 10 single 105mm or 4.1-inch armament until well into the dreadnought era, and likewise the protected cruisers did not rise above 4,000 tons prior to the launch of dreadnought. Armoured cruisers would generally, Prince Heinrich aside, continue to resemble small pre-dreadnoughts, albeit with smaller guns than the battleships now. After first Bismarck and the aforementioned Prince Heinrich, they dropped from 9.4-inch to 8.3-inch guns with a decent 150mm or 5.9-inch secondary battery, albeit the 5 ships that were constructed after first Bismarck hovered at around about 10,000 tons displacement due to limited German shipyard space for larger hulls. The biggest of the slipways were always occupied by battleships or ocean liners. The break from this pattern would only eventually come with the Scharnhorsts at the end of the armoured cruiser era. Battleship construction reverted to the more traditional type, using big guns instead of smaller, faster-firing versions, and this was largely in response to the advent of longer-ranged fire. The Braunschweig and Deutschland classes both carried pairs of twin 11-inch gun turrets for the main battery, and large secondary batteries made up of 170mm guns, or roughly 6.7 inches. This made Germany one of the few navies not to build semi-dreadnoughts, although the wisdom of this particular choice of gun caliber does remain somewhat debatable, as it offered only a slightly heavier shell than the 6-inch, or roughly equivalent gun, that was found on most other pre-dreadnoughts, while not actually offering a significantly greater rate of fire than the 7.5-inch or even 9.2-inch guns which were being deployed by their primary expected adversary. Nonetheless, the course was now set, and the Kaiserliche Marine was about to start a rapid ascent through the ranks of world-class navies that would culminate in the Battle of Jutland, before finally fading out in the cold northern waters of Scapa Flow.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.